Is the PowerPoint for Chapter 6 of Sociology 3392, Indexes, Scales, and Typologies. So indexes, scales, and typologies are all composite measures of variables. So what is a composite measure? So we talked a little bit in Chapter 5 about, what a variable is and the different levels of measurement. And some variables, are composed of one item. So for example, gender is usually, male, female, sometimes other will be included as well. But sometimes our variables are a little bit more different. There's multi-dimensions of a concept. So for example, we talked a little bit about socioeconomic status, SES, and sometimes we measure it just using income, but a more, complete way of measuring this would be income, education, and job prestige. So again, there's different dimensions of socioeconomic status. So when we have these variables with multiple dimensions, we use either an index, a scale, or a typology or a composite measure. So we do this when there's no clear, unambiguous single indicators, and we also do it because it's efficient for data analysis. So indexes and scales are what we're going to talk about first. It's a little tricky to get right away, if you're looking at a variable and deciding whether it's an index or a scale. For your final paper, you're probably not going to use this. You can if you like, but you don't have to, but it's definitely going to be on the exam. So an index is the sort of more basic composite measure. So basically, it's accumulated scores of individual indicators. So you count the number of indicators that are present. Scales are a little bit more complicated because you're not just adding these indicators together. There's a logical or empirical structure of indicators. So some indicators are better than others, and there's sort of different intensities or sometimes even weighted a little differently. So the more important ones are weighted higher in, the variable's composite score. Okay, so an index example. This is an index that I use all the time in my research, self-reported offending, SRO. Basically, this is just 24 different delinquent items and you just add it up to, see how delinquent somebody is. This is used all the time in adolescent research when we're looking at delinquency. So some of the things are kind of, things that maybe are less serious, such as shoplifting, maybe sold marijuana. Those are kind of things that a lot of kids do. But some of these things, killed somebody, forced someone to have sex, shot at somebody, these are very, very, very serious crimes that not a lot of people would have done. So I would say that this is probably an index that would not be very useful for, a general youth population. But maybe if we were looking at populations of very serious offenders, these would, be more, it would be more appropriate for that. So, this is sort of, again, the most basic way. So you count how many of these different acts somebody has done. So maybe they've done 5 out of the 24. Maybe somebody else has done 10 out of the 24. We would probably say that person that did the 10 more delinquent acts would be more delinquent. However, the problems with indexing is that, these delinquent acts aren't equal. Again, shoplifting compared to killed someone, they're both weighted the same in this index. And that, causes some problems because would we say that somebody who has, destroyed property and shoplifted to be more delinquent than somebody who has killed somebody? Probably not. So, there's a little bit of an issue there when it comes to indexes. Okay. So because of these issues with indexes, we also have scales, which again is a little bit more, proper way of doing things sometimes. Sometimes we don't need a scale. Sometimes an index is fine. But for a lot of these composite measures, an index is more appropriate. So this is an example of an index. So this is the Revived Conflict Tactics Scale. This is used all the time when looking at domestic violence, intimate partner violence, teen dating violence. So in this scale, some items are better indicators of partner violence than others. So we score people based on their response patterns rather than just adding each item up. So again, it's, maybe the physical, psychological aggression would be seen as, less serious than injury. Okay, so there's a few different types of scales that we're going to talk about, a few different ways of making scales. So this is an example of a scale for political activism. So there's indicators of political activism that sort of represent these varying degrees. So we would say that people who voted, most people tend to vote, and it's sort of seen as a lower indicator of activism. So a lot of people vote, and then when we look at sort of the highest degree of activism here, it's ran for office. Not a lot of people run for office. So here we can see that somebody who has indicators of a higher degree of activism probably has all the lower ones as well. So it's not very likely that we're going to have somebody that runs for office but didn't vote or worked on a political campaign or anything like that. So again, someone who has indicators of a higher degree probably has the lower ones as well. Okay, so indexes versus scales, when do you use them? Again, scales are usually superior to indexes because they take this intensity into consideration. But there's misconceptions. You don't always need a scale. Sometimes, an index works perfectly fine. Sometimes you can't use a scale. The use of scaling techniques do not always work. You can't just kind of willy-nilly add a bunch of things together to make a scale. You have to do what's called a principal components analysis to ensure that your items are related to each other. So scale building takes a little bit. You can't just randomly add stuff. You have to make sure using, statistical methods that we use in like SPSS and Stata to make sure that your scale makes sense and that the items are related to each other. Okay. So index construction. Again, let's look at SRO, self-reported offending. So first, we need to look at item selection. So again, we need face validity for our indexes, meaning that our individual items need to be offenses. We can't, have an index on self-reported offending with one of the items being, do you enjoy pizza? It doesn't make sense, right? So that's kind of the first step. The next thing needs to be unit dimensionality, so one dimension of a concept. So when we're making our self-reported offending scale, victimization is really related to offending, but it's probably not very useful to add here. So we want to decide whether we want to be general or specific. Again, there's no right or wrong answer, it's just depending on your research question. So are we picking all offenses or just a subset of offenses? So maybe violent offenses or property offenses. And finally, variance. Does everybody answer in the same way? If so, you don't need to include that item in your index. So for example, if we're asking our sample whether, in our delinquency sample, whether they have driven more than 1 mile over the speed limit ever. Well, most people probably have. Maybe not, kids if they're not driving yet, but adults probably. So it's probably not going to be useful to add. Same as our, killed someone or murdered somebody item. It's probably not going to be very useful to include in, a delinquency index that's aimed at looking at the delinquency of middle school kids. So it's very, very highly unlikely that a middle school kid would have killed someone. And if they did, they're probably not going to answer that they did on a survey. Okay, we also want to make sure we examine the empirical relations. So we want to make sure the items in the scale are related to each other. So again, the first step of this is going to be to look at the bivariate relationships. So is there a relationship between the two variables? We test this using correlation coefficients, and then, when we're finished building our scale, we do a principal components analysis to make sure everything, is related to each other, and it sort of kicks out the items that we really don't need in that scale. So if there's a perfect relationship between two variables, so either 1 or -1, then you do not need to include both of them. You'd only need to include one because they're capturing the exact same thing. Okay, so index scoring. So we want to determine the desirable range of the index scores. So the problem is, if we use that SRO index that we looked at a few slides ago, there's some, less serious crimes, but a lot of those crimes were very, very serious. So including only very serious crimes like murder, kidnapping, and armed robbery, we're not going to have very much variance in our sample. So of course, it depends on your sample that you're looking at and your population. Is our sample going to be death row inmates? Well, maybe then that's going to be appropriate to include those very serious crimes. But if we're looking at TTU students, if we're just including those 3 crimes in our index, we're probably going to get the vast, vast, vast majority of people, maybe even everybody, saying that they've committed 0 of them. So we want to determine whether to give each item in the index equal or different weights. Again, we might decide that a murder gets a weight of 3, while shoplifting gets a weight of 1. The vast majority of indexes, things are weighted equally, but we could change this if we wanted to. Again, maybe property offenses are weighted at 2. If you have 2 property offenses and 1 violent offense, well, maybe you weight the violent offense 2 times more because it's usually seen as more delinquent than a property offense. Okay, so index validation. So item analysis. Does each item make an independent contribution? If not, get rid of it. There's no point in having things that don't need to be there. If we're not seeing variance within our sample, then we don't need to include it in the index. External validation. So examine the relationship between other indicators of the same variable. So we want to see if things are related to each another. If not, again, get rid of it. We don't need it. We're trying to keep our indexes as simple as possible. So options for handling missing data. So maybe we're going to exclude them. This might introduce bias in our responses. We might treat missing data as one of the available responses. We might sort of analyze the missing data to interpret their meaning. So why are so many people answering that they have never murdered someone? Does this mean that, yes, they did murder someone? Maybe we're going to look into this a little bit further. A popular way of dealing with missing data is to just do mean substitution, meaning that we assign every missing value the mean value of the variable. Next, we might assign values to the proportion of variables scored. So maybe, we're going to consider a survey that has 99% complete give it a little bit more weight than a survey that only has 10% complete. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different scales that we might use. First is the Bogardus social distance scale. So this is a measurement technique to determine the willingness of people to participate in social relations. So looking at the various degrees of closeness with other types of people. So this is a little example here on the left-hand side about the acceptance of sex offenders. So the sort of first step is, are you willing to let sex offenders live in your country? Most people would probably say yes. However, when we look at the last one, would you let your child marry a sex offender? Most people are probably going to say no. Again, those who would let their child marry a sex offender are probably going to say yes to the other items as well. This is a Thurstone scale. We don't use this very often in social research. It's used sometimes. It's a type of composite measure constructed in accord with weights assigned by judges to various indicators of some variables. So here we're getting judges who are experts in the field to give weights to certain variables. We don't use this very often because it's very expensive. You're probably going to have to pay a consulting fee to have these judges, decide on the weights of your variables. It's just not used very often. So here is a scale that is used a ton in social research. Lots, non-social research too, market research, kind of everything. Anything that involves humans, we use these Likert type scales. You've probably filled them out many, many times. So the original Likert scale is a little bit different than that. The Likert type scale is based on that, and that's the one we use today. So these are standardized response categories that determine the relative intensity of different items. So true Likert scale calculates average scores for those agreeing with each statement, but we don't really use those a lot anymore. We use these Likert type scales. So if you see, a question saying, how much do you agree with the following statement? Agree, disagree, strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree. You're probably looking at a Likert type scale. And again, we use these all the time. Semantic differential scale. This is a questionnaire in which the respondent is asked to rate something in terms of two opposite adjectives. This is not used very often in social research. Again, it's used a lot in market research. So, did you find something enjoyable or unenjoyable, and rate it on that scale? Again, maybe sometimes. I don't see it very often in, criminology research. I think it's something that's more done with market research. Okay, a Gutman scale. So this summarizes several discrete observations to represent some more general variable. So again, this has strong indicators and weak indicators that can be ranked. So this is a Gutman scale for support of abortion. So someone who gives a strong indicator will also support weaker indicators. So if somebody, supports abortion when the woman is not married, are probably going to support it for pregnant as a result of rape, and if a woman's health is seriously endangered. So this is just a example of a Gutman scale, and this is sort of how it's added up. Again, I'm not going to ask you how to do this, little math problem here on a test, but I will probably ask you what a Gutman scale is and what it's used for. Finally, the last thing we're going to talk about is typologies. This is a classification of observations in terms of their attributes on two or more variables. So this is sort of the patterns that people are taking when we're analyzing our data, what their scores are on certain variables, and sort of grouping people into categories. So an example, we have lots of offender typologies. So for example, sex offender typologies. Not every researcher is going to have the same typologies. Usually everyone sort of gets something different depending on, the variables they're using, the sample that they're using. So here we have two different examples of sex offender typologies and their sort of characteristics. First typology, do they commit sex offenses only? Do they commit sex and other offenses? Or do they commit sex and violent offenses? And the characteristics of each of these types of offenders. So the second typology looked at the victims. So intrafamilial offenders offend only in the family settings with, less victims, or familial offenders that have a larger average of victims.